Hi and welcome to the Hormonal Mama. I'm Kara. Today we are talking Skin Anatomy 101. I wanted to take a couple of minutes to kind of give you an understanding of the skin so you can understand a little bit more about what I do as an esthetician. I'll do another video talking about what an esthetician is. Hint, it's not an anesthesiologist. But today we're just talking the layers of the skin so that you can understand the skin a little bit better and why taking care of your skin can help during infertility, pregnancy, and postpartum. All right, so the first thing to understand about the skin is that it covers the entire body. It serves as a barrier for the body, and it protects the body from things like moisture, cold, damaging sun rays, microorganisms, and all kinds of things. Okay, so the skin is broken down into 3 layers. We have the outermost layer, which is the epidermis. Then you have the dermis, followed by the hypodermis. Now, each of these layers is broken down into further layers with more information, including the function of each layer within the layer and what the different structures are within that layer. So the first layer of skin that I want to talk about is the epidermis. The epidermis is the outermost layer of skin. It's what you can see everywhere on the body, okay? The epidermis is very thin. It's only about 0.1 millimeters thick, the entire epidermis, okay? That's really thin. It is made up of 5 layers, but only on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Everywhere else on the body is 4 layers. I'm going to tell you about all 5 layers, though, so that you understand that. It is the body's first line of defense, the epidermis. So let's break it down. So the epidermis is broken down, like I said, into 5 layers. The first layer, the outermost layer, is the stratum corneum, okay? This layer is made up of flattened dead skin cells. So when you look at the stratum corneum underneath a microscope, you're going to see flattened cells that look like this because they're flat. They have no nucleus and no organelles. It's about 20 to 30 layers, so even though it's a lot of layers, it's still very, very thin, right? The entire epidermis is 0.1 millimeter thick, which is about as thick as a sheet of paper. But the stratum corneum, which is just 1 layer within the epidermis, is 20 to 30 layers of flattened dead skin cells, okay? And remember, the epidermis serves as the first line of defense, and the stratum corneum is the outermost layer of the epidermis. So the stratum corneum is going to serve as that first protective barrier. After the stratum corneum lies the stratum lucidum. Now, the stratum lucidum is a very, very thin layer. It's only 2 to 3 layers of cells, and it's clear. It is a clear layer. It only exists on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, like I was talking about a couple of minutes ago. This is the only place on the body that you have the stratum lucidum. It thickens, or not thickens, but it's part of the area where you have thicker skin, and that is part of that area. It's only 2 to 3 layers of cells, like I said. They're flattened cells, just like the stratum corneum. So again, these cells don't have a nucleus. They don't have any organelles. There's no meat to it, if you will. And that, again, sits just below the stratum corneum. Next up is the stratum granulosum. The stratum granulosum is the 3rd layer underneath the stratum lucidum, or if we're talking about anywhere else on the body except the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, then it is the 2nd layer, okay? It is only 3 to 5 layers of skin cells. So again, this is a fairly thin layer, but because the cells here are not flattened yet. They're on their way to being flattened. So they're going through the flattening process. So they're a little bit thicker, but still only 3 to 5 layers of cells. So it's still a fairly thin layer. So the cells in this layer work primarily to form a waterproof barrier to prevent fluid loss from the body. That is its main function. The stratum spinosum is the next layer. So it's the fourth layer or third, depending on where we're talking about in the body. And it sits directly below the stratum granulosum. So the stratum spinosum is made up of 8, so you can see, 8 to 10 layers of polyhedral cells. What is polyhedral? So basically that means three-dimensional. So instead of being flattened, it's three-dimensional, and it's got a bunch of sides to it, right? Think like a hexagon or an octagon or something, but think three-dimensional, like dice or something. I mean, that's only 4 sides, but the point is that it's three-dimensional and it has multiple sides. Keratinization or keratinization, however you want to pronounce that, begins in this layer and is the process where cells die and harden and become hair and nails. It's pretty interesting to me. I mean, this happens within the skin and pushes cells upward, and that's what you have in your fingernails and in your hair. So the bottom layer of the epidermis is the stratum basal or stratum germinativum. It's known as either of these depending on what textbook or article you're reading. So this layer contains stem cells that create keratinocytes or keratinocytes. It really depends. Again, pronunciation with medical terms can vary. So the stem cells create the keratinocytes. This is also the layer that contains melanocytes, which are cells that give our skin pigment or color or melanin. Beneath the epidermis lies the dermis. The dermis is much, much thicker than the epidermis, right? We talked about the epidermis and how it's only 0.1 millimeters thick. The dermis is about 2 millimeters thick. So even though 2 millimeters is like, well, that's really, really little, it's a lot thicker than the epidermis. So the dermis itself contains nerves, blood vessels, lymph vessels, hair follicles, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, and other structures. We have 2 layers to the dermis, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So the papillary dermis, which is the top layer, also known as the papillary layer, contains collagen and elastin fibers which form together to create a loose mesh, right? So kind of a mesh is kind of something like this. This is what they do. They come together loosely. They're not tightly woven together or anything like that. It's loose and creates kind of this loose mesh. This layer also contains phagocytes, which are defensive cells, nerve fibers, touch receptors, and lymphatic capillaries. So there are a lot of different things within this layer. The second layer of the dermis is the reticular layer. Within the reticular layer, we have dense irregular connective tissue. So in the papillary layer, if you remember, we were talking about this loose mesh. This is tightly packed together, right? Very dense, irregular connective tissue. It also contains the hair roots, sebaceous glands, sweat glands, and blood vessels. So there's a lot going on within the reticular dermis. The final layer of the skin is the hypodermis. The hypodermis is also known as subcutaneous tissue, the subcutaneous layer, or the subcutis. For our purposes, I'm going to call it the hypodermis. The hypodermis is the bottom layer below the dermis. It contains primarily, mostly, adipose tissue. What is adipose tissue? Fat tissue. That's all it is. It also contains fibroblasts, macrophages, there we are, loose areolar connective tissue, larger nerves, and blood vessels. It's supposed to say blood cells, not vessels. I don't know why I wrote vessels. Blood cells. Okay, so again, the hypodermis has a lot going on in there, but not as much. Doesn't have really any layers to it. It's one layer, and it's just densely packed with mostly fat tissue and a few other cells within there. So there you have it, all 8 layers of skin. You have your epidermis broken down into the 5 layers. We have our stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basal or germinativum, followed by the dermis, which is broken into the papillary layer and the reticular layer, followed all the way at the bottom with the hypodermis, which is made up of mostly adipose tissue. There are your 8 layers. I hope this was really beneficial to you. Stay tuned to my next episode when I break down for you how skincare products work and what each product's purpose is. Look forward to it.